Hello. So I'm going to be covering Chapter 2, the Ancient Near East or Mesopotamia. Several of the images that I'm going to show you are those that you're responsible for, but there are a few that are extra additional images to help you understand the culture of this time period. We are moving into a time period that is described as civilizations, this birth of civilizations. And so something I'll ask you to do, and this is also an essay question, is to define that word. What what elements do you need to be defined as a civilization? And primarily historians are doing this, defining certain groups of civilizations versus others. And then think about the next two questions. Are there any problems with using these terms, this term? And then um, based on your definition, what evidence of civilizations have we already seen? Meaning go back to chapter 1 and look at the groups that we discussed and do they fit this category. But where we're moving now is Mesopotamia. It means land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And you can see where we are. This is present day Iran and Iraq, Middle Eastern region. Mesopotamia is a Greek word which means land between two rivers. So what we're going to focus on is what these groups, the terms these groups would have used to describe themselves. And they have been translated into English for the most part. And so we're going to see them as individual groups, but even keep in mind that these names are names that are translations into English. But the area is known as a Fertile Crescent because it did frequently flood and create an area, and you can see the green here, created an area where agriculture was very, how can I say, agriculture was the primary food source. People were still hunting, but as we've talked about, people have now settled. They are now constructing cities, and they are planting their crops. And this is a good place to do that. And while we're there are with civilization. This is a time period about 3000 BC when major regions are being settled, and archaeologists, historians have established four regions in the world where they believe civilizations began. And you're looking at two of them here. We're starting with the ancient Near East, or Mesopotamia, because this is where the first group, the Sumerians, is believed to have settled. And we're going to talk about in a moment why the Sumerians are considered the first civilization. But note that the civilizations developed around the rivers. That's one criteria. You need water as a resource. And so I mentioned there were four. Mesopotamia is one area where groups settled. The second one is here. When we move to the next chapter, we're going to be talking about Egypt and the Nile. And so Egypt is the second area where civilizations developed. And there are two others that we don't cover in this class. They're actually covered in Art 125, Arts of the Asian Continent. It's in the Indus Valley in present-day India, and the Yellow River, or the Shanxi River, located probably central north, going towards the north, kind of just above the central part of China, heading towards the north, towards Mongolia. And so those are the four areas where historians state civilizations developed. And the key thing is they all developed around major bodies of water. So Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, China. And so we're starting with the Sumerians because they are believed to be the first, but there are other groups we're going to discuss: the Sumerians, Akkadians, Guti, Amorites, Hittites, Babylonians, Assyrians, Medes, Neo-Babylonians, and in with the Persians, and the Sasanians are in there as well. Many groups in this region. There was a lot of turnover in this region. As one group came into power, another group would organize, and then they would overturn that group. And so that's why we're seeing so many. We're not going to cover all of them, but note that there was this frequent changing of power, and with that, the capitals would move. And each of these regions were called city-states, and they were city-states that were run by a government, particularly a king or someone who would have the title of high priest. They did have an established religion. We're going to talk about gods, and these gods are accompanied with stories, and we're going to start to read some of these stories. And in fact, I'm going to mention one work I want you to look up, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I asked you about in one of the stories, but I'm going to mention several others. And with gods, they were polytheistic, meaning many gods, not just one. The Book of May was the book of decrees. I mentioned literature like their Bible, and many of these stories are documented there. Also, this is the Bronze Age, when bronze starts to be used as a product, and we are going to see not only bronze, which is a tin and copper alloy, meaning a mixture of tin and copper, but we're going to start to see alabaster and lapis lazuli and gypsum and others bitumen, these other materials. Some of them use prior, but we're going to see them used in a larger quantity here as we move into what's called the Bronze Age. But it's called the Bronze Age because it becomes a main form of production. We're also going to see brick and pottery and discuss a lot about trade. And so, Birth of Civilizations, I want you to look at. I'm going to focus on three groups, but I want you to take a look at the others in your book. I'm focusing on three to keep the voiceover at a reasonable time length. Otherwise, it could be an hour long easily. So I'm going to focus on the Sumerians. Let me go back here. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. And while going through chapter 3, I want you two things that you should sort of overarching themes that you should keep in mind. First, why are these considered civilizations? And then apply those same criteria to the groups I'm not lecturing on. And then what is unique about each group? What makes the Sumerians Sumerians? What makes the Akkadians Akkadians? What did they produce that represents their culture, their value, kind of their belief system? And there's an essay question where I ask you to outline these ideas and then choose works of art that demonstrate those ideas. So that's what I'd like you to do while going through and reading the entire chapter. So the Sumerians, they are considered the first civilization because they developed the language, cuneiform. But you should go through your list and see all of those other elements because it's not just language. Language is a form of communication. What are they communicating? How are they organized? And so on. But the language for the Sumerians is cuneiform. And cuneiform is a type, let me go here. It's a type of script that is pictograph as well as geometric shapes. And you can see the pictograph is here. And here's the early cuneiform sign that was based on the pictograph where they've reduced it to these geometric shapes. And then the later cuneiform sign. And here a bowl. And you can see it has some resemblance to its original form, but it becomes more geometric, and then a head in a bowl, and so on. And you look at this and you're like, how do people read that? And you think about, in addition to, in terms of civilization, developing this language, this is something a group of people are going to agree upon, just like we have multiple languages, that there are thousands of languages in the world, but we have a language as a form of communication. How did you learn that language? Or if you're bilingual or trilingual, how did you learn those languages? And again, there's a educational process in place to teach others about these signs and symbols. And also keep in mind that even though there's a educational system in place, not everyone has access to that. We're going to talk about over the course of the semester how the majority of the population was illiterate, and what they relied upon were images that told stories that they would hear orally. And so going back to the cuneiform, the way these signs and symbols were transferred were onto clay using a cylinder seal. And this is a cylinder seal that you're seeing here. It's usually a piece of, I'm going to show you some materials, alabaster or clay. Here's alabaster here, shaped a type of stone that's shaped and carved with these symbols on it. And then you can see here, there's one of bluestone, not quite lapis lazuli, but a bluestone. You can see the shapes and symbols are carved in reverse relief. And then as a strip of clay is laid out, if you've ever watched the Flintstones, the chipping and pounding of the clay, imagine rolling a stone across the clay. But they lay it out, it is damp, and it transfers the images and the signs from the cylinder seal onto the slab of clay. And you can do this on a single piece. You can see this is some of the later symbols. Also stories, a sequence of scenes as they are here. And there are thousands of cylinder seals that are necessary to create a story like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or some of the types of documents that we're seeing in clay, or business contracts, medicinal books, city plans, documentation of gods. Imagine what you write down now and apply that to the ancient Sumerians. They also had individuals of a higher status had cylinder seals with their own signature on it, and they would use it to actually sign a document like a business contract. And so you would have the larger seal with a series of signs and symbols that was perhaps an agreement between two people. And then at the bottom, similar to the way we sign documents today, they would, somewhere on the clay, they would roll out their own personal cylinder seal, noting that they had entered into this agreement. And those, they've been described like someone's social security number. People kept them because it was a way for them to sign something, to agree to something. And so it was an elaborate form of written documentation, and you have to think of all of the different types of literature, as I mentioned, that whole list. And the cylinder seal transferred onto a damp slab of clay is the way that they were communicating via language. And so, going from there, you should note the different types of scenes. They're not always those geometric shapes, as I said. They're also stories. And here you can see where they can go from pictograph form to more of a geometric language form. These are the languages that were used, and this is true throughout Mesopotamia. Each group that we're going to talk about will use some form of cuneiform, but then we're also going to see the development of Hebrew as a script, and it's going to be a variation of that. And some of the later Arabic languages come from this region as well, and it's still primarily the Arabic script, Farsi and so on, are used in this region. And so their roots are here in the cuneiform. And just as a side note, you can click on this link here, click to see your name in cuneiform, and it will take you to a site where you can type in your name and see what it looks like in cuneiform. And it's kind of interesting the way it plays out. But that was a language. We're going to transition into the gods. And just as a summary of the Sumerians were primarily a agricultural people. They did have a high priest. They did have an army. They weren't known as a warlike people. The focus was on maintaining a society. They had poetry, literature, temples dedicated to gods, vegetation gods. They were in an area where they were frequent to floods, and so they had agriculture, but they also had to design structures to protect them from the floods. And they basically built a city or cities with under the Sumerian rule in order to ensure comfort for those living within those regions, and then had an army to protect them from outsiders, but they would ultimately fall. So a lot of the deities that you see from the Sumerians have to do with elements within the universe or elements within nature. Like Anu is the sky god. We talk about Abu, the vegetation god. And then there are also deities that represent like heaven and hell that we will also focus on briefly. But I want to show you two examples of this is going to be the kind of a summary of the Sumerians, the ziggurat and the votive statues that would be placed on top of the ziggurat. So the ruins and plan of the Anu ziggurat, and also here the ziggurat at Ur and present day Iraq. Those are the ziggurats that I'm going to focus on. And I ask you to define a ziggurat. A ziggurat is not the temple in and of itself. The ziggurat is actually the platform. And then the temple would be placed on top. And inside the temple, we'll talk about the votive statues. So the temples were made of sun-dried brick, grass, and sand and some clay mixed together and then dried in the sun. And for many of the temples, these sun-dried bricks were like the size of a large shoebox and then stacking one on top of the other. This one is 40 feet high. The one at Ur is 240 feet high. You can see a man standing here. Sorry, 240 feet wide, about 100 feet high. You can see the man standing here on the edge and how monumental they are. And that's for two reasons. One, because of the flooding. And you recently heard about flooding in Palestine and so on, similar to that, the flooding in the region. And then also think about a platform and how it raises you up, and you're raising you up towards the sky, and you're reaching up towards the heavens. And keep that in mind, because that's going to be a common theme throughout the entire semester. When you have a sacred structure where you want to communicate to the gods, the perception is that the gods are residing in the heavens. And so you want to build a structure that's going to get you closer to them. Structures are built, but they're also mountains. Think of mountains and how they reach upwards. And so people will be using mountain tops as a way to reach the heavens. This is very true in Native American groups, and then creating mounds. Or they're going to be constructing buildings or temples that dominate a city-state. And for the Sumerians, their ziggurats dominated each of their city-states. Like Ur is one of the city-states, Uruk is one of the city-states, Eshnuna is another city-state. So they were, think of states like California, Nevada, and so on in the United States. Think of the Sumerian civilization, and then there are separate city-states. And within each city-state, there is a ziggurat. And again, the ziggurat is a platform, and then on top, you have the temple. And the temple is dedicated to that particular city-state's main god. And for the people at Uruk, it was Anu, the sky god. And so a priest would walk up the steps, and at Uruk, it was a bent axis type procession upwards, meaning the priest would make kind of it's called circumambulate, or make his way around to the very top of the ziggurat to the temple. And then here at Ur, this was dedicated to Inanna, and we're going to talk a little bit about Inanna, but it was more of a straight procession up towards the top, and the temple would be located here. And you can see these are very small bricks. Actually, I have a close up. Very small bricks. Some of them have been redone, but the bricks you can see a shoebox size, and the man's foot is on one. You can get a sense of how the procession would make its way. Someone would make its way up the processional steps. And this, again, I want to stress that it's for the priests. Everyone could not go to the top of the ziggurat. It was for those who had sacred access to the deities. And so at Ur, it was dedicated to Inanna. And a little bit about Ur, because I do ask you to know this ziggurat. It's believed to be the home of in the biblical context, Abraham. They did worship the goddess Inanna. And I ask you about Inanna. I'm going to jump ahead to Inanna. Here, Inanna, the goddess or holy virgin of love, birth, protection, marriage, war. Some of her iconography, the lion or lioness, and remember back to the lion and the significant role the lion played, as we saw at Chatal Huyuk. Also, she has, I'm going to go here, her iconography, because our focus is on iconography. She's typically shown with a horned headdress, and the horn connect to the bull power, and she's also the goddess of war. She's holding the rod and ring of justice, again, law, order, and so on. She has wings so that she can soar, all seeing, all knowing. Also, this panel was painted, and you can see it here, black, the color of night, and also owls who can see at night, and then also the talons on also the bird, and also on her feet. Notice she's a hybrid figure. She can go down and capture. And then the lines that are there are symbols of power. And she's actually, the way her talons are coming down, she's perched on the lions, but she's symbolically on a mountaintop. And as I mentioned, mountains are seen as access points to the heavens. So Inanna, very important deity. And I have here two names, Inanna and Ishtar. As we move to other groups, some will call her Inanna, some will call her Ishtar. In both cases, they have the same kind of properties and iconography associated with them. There's also this reference to Ereshkigal, who was the goddess of the underworld, who was Inanna's sister. And when you think about the darkness of night and also the owls, some have seen this as a representation of Ereshkigal, and she has this kind of ferocious history associated with her, which we'll talk about. But because the imagery, they are sisters, because the imagery, the iconography is similar, there's been some confusion as to who this actually represents. Most agree it's Inanna, but there are similar icons that you'll see with Ereshkigal. And so going back to the ziggurat at Ur, as the priest makes his way to the top, it's dedicated to Inanna. They would then go in the temple and make a dedication to the goddess Inanna. And there may have been a cult statue. Here's a head of a statue. It's about 8 inches. It may have been attached to a wood body with clothing and then inlaid stone and so on to make her look more naturalistic. A dedication would have been made to Inanna. And this would ensure she's a goddess of love. She's a goddess of birth. So if you want to continue to have children, fertility for every species on earth. Protection, going into war. Inanna's going to watch out over you with her wings, watching and seeing. Marriage. So think of all of the attributes of Inanna, and when the priest goes and makes a dedication, they are trying to ensure those things will continue to happen. And then here from the ziggurat at Ur, I have individual images of votive statues that would have went inside of the temple. Like at Uruk, there have been votive statues who are making a dedication to Anu. At here at Ur, the ziggurat in the temple at the very top, there would have been votive statues who are making dedications to Inanna. Basically, these statues are placed inside to represent the people that can't go inside. And so the priest is the only one that can go up, but everyone wants an opportunity to communicate with the deities. And so at Eshnuna, there is a ziggurat, or was a ziggurat, and on the top of the ziggurat, there was a temple. And in the temple, there would have been different rooms. One would have been the main room where the priest would go and make a dedication to the main deity. But then in the other rooms, you would have these smaller votive statues, and they would stay there permanently. They range from a foot to 20 feet. That's hierarchy of scale. The larger ones deemed more important, perhaps wealthy landowners, whereas the small ones, like you're seeing here, someone who doesn't have access to as much resources or doesn't play a key role. But they came in different sizes, and they also represented men and women. Not everyone in society would have one, perhaps one to represent an entire clan or a particular family. But hierarchy of scale is the larger person, the most important person. And one thing to clarify, these are not gods. They are statues representing the people of Sumer who want to make a dedication to a particular god. And you can tell that by the way they're standing. Their hands are together, they're holding a votive cup or an offering cup in their hand. Some of them have inscriptions in cuneiform at their base, little prayers or sayings to the particular god. Notice their eyes. Their eyes are very abstract. They're wide open eyes, and there's a contrast between the alabaster, gypsum, and limestone. To go here, you can see there's an inlay or painted bitumen is a black tar-like substance that would have been used to paint the eyes, and then alabaster, the white stone. Oops, the white stone here would have been used as an inlay, and then some of them created in the gypsum material, or the bulk of the body created in limestone because it's a sturdier stone. So they would have been created with these very abstract wide eyes, so they're always awake 24/7 communicating with the gods. And you can see better in this image the cup that's for the offering, and you can also see on this particular statue there are the reverse relief cuneiform pictographs, and it would have had a story or a saying, a particular message to the deity. And then also notice how they have this very abstract shape to them. Triangular skirts. The men are wearing kilts. The women are wearing these wraps. Their bodies are very angular and frontal and stiff, but you can distinguish between male and female. Some have beards. These may be the wealthy landowners, older men. Some are bald. These are most likely lesser priests who are making a dedication for their family. And then you have the women who have the headdress and the wrap, also probably of a wealthier family. But they are meant to replace the citizens because the citizens can't go to the top of the ziggurat into the temple. So they are always present, always communicating. And so these particular votive statues are in the Abu temple at Eshnuna. They are making a dedication to the god Abu. Anu is the sky god, father of all gods. Enlil is the wind earth deity. So in another city state, if they had an issue with, say, the movement of earth or storms, and they wanted to make this dedication to control the level of intensity of these natural phenomena, they would make a dedication to Enlil. That would be their main god. Um, Ea or Enki is the water god. So if the area was, say, prone to flood or they didn't have enough water, that would be their main god. The temples are dedicated to the gods who are the most important to the people in that particular city state. And then it goes on. Marduk is the bull. Utu is the sun. So for the people of Eshnuna, vegetation, agriculture is of most importance to them. So they want to ensure the continuation of the harvesting of the crops. And so their statues are dedicated to Abu. But I want to move ahead. You should take a look at the figures in between, the pieces in between, offering jars to Inanna, the head of Inanna, Inanna, Ishtar, and so on. The standard of which shows two sides of the Sumerian people, the peace side, agricultural people, but you also have the war side. They did fight battles. They had to protect their resources, some of the materials that they use. This is the bull-headed lyre. They also created musical instruments. Here I want you to look up the story of Gilgamesh. We're going to talk about this in class, the fifth king of Uruk. And also note that this may be him represented here on the lyre, but also take a look at the representation, the zoomorphic and anthropomorphic and tetramorph representations on the front of it's here, on the front of the lyre. A lyre is like a harp. And so there are strings. Do I have one? I don't. I will show you one and have another image and show you. But there are strings here, and then someone will sit and play. And then also take a look at the images and how they've transformed, especially going back to the Paleolithic period. And then you'll go through the Akkadians, which are a northern people. Akkad is their capital. I ask you to know um, here, the victory stele of Naram Sin. What you should do while looking at the images from Acadia and reading about the Akkadians, compare them to the Sumerians. What do you already see that's different? What do you notice here in the list of their characteristics? What do they represent? And how is it, especially focus here, this is one that I ask you to know, how do they represent their culture visually in art form? And then you can compare that to the Sumerians. Note here, some carryover. Inanna and Ishtar, they have both, so it's not interchangeable. One star Inanna, one star Ishtar, and the sun is one of her icons. And so note, why is that here at the top of the stele, which is a commemorative monument. And then this is what I'm going to focus on briefly, the Babylonians. And so the Babylonian people, first the Akkadians conquered the Sumerians, and then the Sumerians came back and rose up again, and then the Babylonians conquered the Sumerians, and then the Akkadians, and so they came into power, and they came into power under Hammurabi. And something I want to highlight: the Akkadians introduced a version of cuneiform, the Semitic language, which is the origin of the Hebrew language, Semites, Jews, Hebrews, and Arabs. And so you have a variation. It looks somewhat similar, pictographs and geometric shapes, but slightly different. You can say another dialect of cuneiform. But I want you to now focus on Hammurabi. Also, Semitic language, the version of cuneiform is here, inscribed on this stele, which is the Code of Hammurabi. And with the establishment of Babylon as a new capital after conquering these other groups, Hammurabi had to come up with a way to maintain order. And so what he did was establish very strict laws to regulate society. And the common phrase for his laws is an eye for an eye. And so with Hammurabi, the laws, and I should say some of these laws are documented in your book. One is you have to pay in kind if you cheat someone in a transaction. You have to return what was taken, as well as an additional penalty, giving up some of your, say, your livestock or agriculture, even personal relationships, not violating the land of another family or their spouse, so to speak, and there's harsh punishment for those who commit adultery. So many of the punishments were death. You would lose your life in most cases if you violated one of the more extreme laws. But there are 282 articles or laws that regulated society that led to Hammurabi's establishment of Babylon as the capital. And as I said, they are all inscribed here in this language, which is again, the Semitic people, so it's a version of the cuneiform language. But this stele documents two things. One, literal documentation of the laws. It's about 7 feet high, and so people wouldn't be able to actually see unless they were, very tall. Some of the laws, and they're very small, inscribed at the very top. But it's more so a visual reminder. These are the laws that you must follow. But then at the top, this is what I want you to focus on. You have on the right-hand side Shamash, who is the main god. This is the god of the sun, and he has flames coming, his icon, flames coming out of his shoulders. He's wearing the horn helmet, the same horn helmet we saw on Inanna, which is a symbol of his power and his might. And he's also holding the staff and the ring of justice. The ring is here, the staff is here. And he's seated on, and you notice his tiered platform. This is a ziggurat that he's seated on. And seated on the ziggurat, that means that he is connected to the heavens. He is residing in heaven. And on the left-hand side, you have Hammurabi, who is coming before him, and he's making this gesture. He's standing in this composite view where his profile, but his body is frontal, and his legs are in profile. And he's making this gesture with his right arm, and his left arm is underneath. And it's supposed to be an icon of respect or symbol of respect, honoring Shamash. And in return, Shamash is handing him the staff of justice. And this is important because in order for Hammurabi to enforce, first develop, hand out, communicate, and then enforce these laws, he has to have approval from the gods. And so at the top of the stele, this is the focal point. This is what he wants people to see. He wants people to see that he has permission from Shamash to enforce these laws and to, again, regulate society. And so when people are walking around the capital of Babylon and they see the 7-foot stele, even if they don't hear the laws, even if they don't have a document in their hands with the laws written out, just seeing that is going to remind them to control their behavior and to follow the laws. And so it was a way for him to bring order in Babylon. And so that's the image I'm going to show you from Hammurabi. But I want you to notice as we've gone through here with the Sumerians, there was this focus on temples and deities worshiping gods to control natural environment. If you look closely at the Akkadian image, it was a scene of battle and war with armies and kings and so on. So different focus. With Hammurabi, it's law. And the Babylonians, to move on, they fell to the Hittites. And the Hittites we're going to discuss in class. They are, or you read about in your textbook for discussion. And I'm not going to focus on them here, but I want you to note that there's another changing of the central power. They're actually located in Turkey, Anatolia, Turkey, and they came in from the north, from Turkey, into the near Middle East, and they took over and established their capital in Turkey, but they maintained power over the people of Mesopotamia. But where we're going to, and you can see here, Hittites from the north, this is their capital, coming from the north into Mesopotamia. And here are some scenes from their Lion Gate in Anatolia, Turkey. Again, remember the lion and the significance of the lion and why we're seeing it repeatedly with these groups. But the last group on that I'm going to focus on just briefly are the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are also northern, not as far north as the Hittites, but they are located here. And we notice how close they are to, this is Sargon II, the Akkadians. The Akkadians were here as well. Babylon is here. The Sumerians, their cap we just talked about the temple, the ziggurat dedicated to Inanna. Nana is another dialect, another way of saying her name. But the Sumerians were here closer to what is now the Persian Gulf. But the Akkadians, the Assyrians, as well as the Hittites, they're located here. And I want you to note their location and the focus, because this northern position is in a very, say, strategic as well as vulnerable site. This is the trade route between the east and the west. You have, as you move further east, you're going through Persia, you're ultimately going to end up in say India, the Asian continent, and places like China. But then as you move further west, you have Greece, Italy, what are going to become Greece and Italy and Rome and so on. And so people are trading, going this way and this way. And so they are right in the middle. And so they have people coming in and out. So the Akkadians and the Assyrians, as well as the Hittites, were more focused on war, protecting. They had to protect their resources. Out of the three, the Assyrians were considered the most battle conscious, so to speak, and they had ways of protecting themselves, but also ensuring that they could maintain their power. And what they did, again, ruled by kings, they built a series of citadels, and this is a diagram of one of their citadels. So you think fortified walls, you're going to need, the reason for the fortified walls is because you want to protect yourself. This particular citadel was 5 miles. You can say the entire circumference of the citadel, 5 miles. The highest wall was 40 feet high. Notice there's a ziggurat there, temple, there are gates, there's a palace, there's a throne room, another series of gates. So this is the main gate, and then a secondary gate entering into what would be called a palace complex. They also had channels, irrigation channels to bring water into the site. This goes all the way back to the Sumerians. It's believed the Sumerians had toilets but they had irrigation water running in and out of the site to make they don't have to leave to go get the water. The water comes to them, and that's through gravity, finding an outside water source. And with the flooding in the region, it's not going to be that difficult, but channeling water there. Most of the structures were limestone, but you also have mud brick and also again, the sun-dried brick used to stack the stones with the limestone. So what we're going to focus on are the not so much the citadel, but think about the citadel as this fortified palace, and the king is very secured inside. But the types of images that were produced by the Assyrian kings, and two terms to keep in mind: propaganda and psychological warfare. And the images that they portrayed, that they had constructed, I'm going to focus on two, the Lamaso and one of the relief sculpture. They were meant to send a message to those entering in, as well as to protect those inside. And so with the Lamasu, these are the figures you would see at the gates, and there were a series of gates leading into the Assyrian citadel. So the first entry gate, and then the gate leading in to see the palace complex, to see the king. And the Lamasu is a hybrid figure. See, hybrid kind of means two. Um, there's another term to describe three or more, like we saw tetramorph and so on. But it's a combination of a bull, and think why a bull, and a bird. I mentioned a bird, why a bird, and the head of a man. So why a man? And then notice here the horned helmet that we've seen a couple of times, with here this feathered headdress. Why feathers? Why horns? But rather than showing them as distinct, unique figures, what the carver has done under Sargon II, the king of the time, is created this mixture of beings. And then they are monumental. They are 13 feet high, and they are at the entryway to the citadel. And so if you think about the bird is all seeing, all knowing, the bull is all powerful, the intellect of the human being, that is a super powerful protective figure. And it's protecting them not only from actual visitors to the citadel, but also invisible spirits. What are those invisible forces that can harm you? And so the Lamasu, which because it can fly is all knowing, all seeing, can protect against those beings as well. And then behind, here's a sense of the scale of the Lamasu. They are monumental. So you're going to be, this is that psychological warfare. You're going to seem very small in relation to the imagery of the Assyrians. And the design of them, I'm going to show you one other thing. The design is very abstract. You would call this a very formal, very strict, rigid repetition of certain shapes that create a pattern, but it's very structured, looks very refined, carved to a degree so that it's abstract, geometric shapes, but then when brought all together, you have these recognizable forms, but it's described as a very formal, and it makes it somewhat regal, enhances its power because it's not haphazard or abstract. It's very structured. And so with that, it adds to the power of the Lamasu figure. And then behind the Lamasu here, you have these genie figures, and these genies, genie with the magic lamp, you think of Aladdin and all of that. But genies they are, you think magician, but they are these spiritual beings on earth who also have the power to protect. And they are known for first anointing and looking after the Lamasu, and also looking after those who are passing through the gate, those who are worthy of protection. They're giving them a blessing. And then they also protect. Notice they have wings, they have the horn helmet. So these are symbols of power. So they are also very powerful. And also notice the his leg, the muscle tone in his leg. And they're human legs, but it has this kind of animalistic type quality with the exaggeration of the muscle tone. But it's a supernatural being. And what he has in his hands, there's a pine cone and water. And the pine cone is seen as, it's actually mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh and also in other epic stories as a source of magic and spirituality. And what the genie is doing is he would be dipping the pine cone into the water, and as people walk through, he's sprinkling them with this water. And so the water is like a conduit. It transfers the power of the pine cone with the power of the genie mixed in, because he's the one that can do this, onto those who are walking through, and then also onto the Lamasu to further empower the Lamasu. So the genie accompanies. So as you're walking through, let me go back Here, as you're walking through, you walk past the Lamasu, and then you can see the genie here sprinkling that blessing on you as you go through. So this seems rather tame. You have these supernatural beings that are protecting the citadel, watching out over for visible and invisible beings, and then also the genie who's blessing those that are coming in. And the Assyrians were a spiritual people. They did worship their gods. Their main god was Assur. You can see this is the name of the king, Assur Narsapal. But if you just take that root word Assur, that's the name of their main god. It's a sun with wings, and it's all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful sun. And it does show up as this small winged circular being in some of their images. So the Assyrians did worship their gods, but as you go into the palace, the imagery changes. And this gives you an idea. This is really panels that were taken out of the Middle East and are now in the British Museum. We'll talk about colonial expansion at another time. But long hallways, passageways with limestone relief sculpture of the Assyrian kings. And you can see, you should know who these are, genies, and here's the Assyrian king. The genie is blessing the king. And then you have these panels here. You notice the bow and arrows that are here. There are scenes of war between Assyrians and other groups, but more so between Assyrians and lions. And this is where I'm going to end because the voiceover is getting rather long. And by this point, because we've seen this type of iconography, this symbolism before, you should be able to construct a narrative and then answer the question, why would they repeat so many images of kings destroying lions? And I'm going to, I have two questions here, but I'm going to go through some basic elements. You have the army, you have the king, hierarchy of scale. The king will always be shown larger than everyone else. They have their horses and their chariots. Notice what's happening to the lions that are here. Notice the way the lions are portrayed. What types of lines would you use to describe the way they portray the lions? What types of lines are they using to portray the soldiers that are shooting arrows at the lion? What about the construction of the space? Active, dynamic space that shows movement. And you have to think about the formal elements and the way the scene is portrayed and what types of message it's sending. This one here, battle between the Assyrians and people. These are three priests that are fleeing back to their hometown. The Assyrians are in hot pursuit of these three men, but they are fleeing. They actually had flotation devices so they could swim in water, breathing devices. That's what you're seeing here. But notice here, same thing. Notice the formal elements of the enemy versus the formal elements of here, the Assyrians, and then also those who are protecting the enemy. But this is the focal point here. How would you summarize the contrasts in the representation of these individual beings? And I'm going to show you a couple of others. Here's the dying lioness from one image from the palace of Ashurbanipal, another Assyrian king. How does this image reinforce the power of the Assyrians? Think about the significance of the lion, and then how is the lion being portrayed? And also, while I'm here, these were painted, and so the lion would have been painted a naturalistic color, and then the carvings here would have been painted red, the blood gushing out. And then here you have this sea of lions that have been killed, and then you have the Assyrian soldier kind of hot pursuit. Same thing here. So take a look at these images and note how this can be used as psychological warfare, political propaganda. And again, you have to keep in mind this one here where he's pulling the lion's tail. The lion's getting really mad. His tail's being pulled. Here he's face to face with the lion, battling the lion, and so on. Note that as you have to take yourself back in time, you are walking down the hallway. You've just gone past the Lamasu. You're now walking down the hallway of the Assyrian palace, and you see one image of the other after the other of either the enemy fleeing or lions being slaughtered. And think about the significance of the lion and how it's been represented prior to this point and what type of message it's sending. And just to give you a hint, the lion was sacred to Ishtar, the lion on the Hittite gate, lion going back to Shatal, Huyuk. The lion has been repeatedly shown as a symbol of power that has served a role as protection. How do the Assyrians use the image of the lion, and how does that benefit them? But that's what you should think about as we go through, and then think about the way they're represented in terms of formal elements, and then we'll pick up with a discussion.